What would you do if everyone around you treated you like a piece of equipment, invisible and replaceable, until one tiny thread changed everything and made hardened military commanders freeze in absolute terror? This is the story of Rebecca Shun, and how 15 seconds of precise needle work saved hundreds of lives and revealed a truth that no one saw coming. The morning mist clung to the windows of the Riverside military installation as Rebecca Chen pulled her faded Honda Civic into the civilian contractor parking area. At 34, she had mastered the art of being overlooked. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Medium height, straight black hair pulled into a simple ponytail, wearing a gray cardigan over dark slacks that had seen better days. Her contractor badge dangled from a worn lanyard, identifying her as what she had been for the past 7 years. Textile Specialist, Level 2, Quartermaster Services Division. Rebecca gathered her weathered canvas bag containing the tools that defined her existence: needles of various sizes, spools of military-grade thread, small scissors worn smooth by countless hours of use, and a magnifying glass for the most delicate work. Inside her bag were also the repair orders that would consume her day: torn uniform seams, loose buttons, damaged insignia, and the endless stream of minor alterations that kept the installation's personnel looking regulation ready. It was meticulous work, the kind that made people's eyes glaze over when she tried to explain what she did for a living at the rare social gatherings she attended. She spent her days hunched over a sewing machine in a basement workshop, fixing the clothing that allowed other people to look professional and competent, while she remained invisible behind her workstation. Rebecca moved through the installation security checkpoints with the practiced efficiency of someone who had navigated the same routine for years. Badge scan at Gate Alpha, polite nod to Security Officer Williams, who always smelled like mint gum and asked about her weekend plans without really listening to the answers. Walk down the main corridor past bulletin boards covered with announcements about training exercises, safety protocols, and commendation ceremonies that never involved people like her. Elevator to the basement level. Another badge scan. Another checkpoint manned by guards who barely looked up from their morning coffee as she passed through the metal detector that had become as familiar as brushing her teeth. The Quartermaster Services Division occupied the lower level of Building C, a sprawling complex that housed the installation's administrative and support functions. Rebecca's world was much smaller than the vast military operation above her head. Workshop B7, positioned in what the staff called the service corridor, a long hallway lined with rooms, where civilian contractors performed the unglamorous but essential work that kept the installation functioning. She shared her section of the corridor with Tom Martinez, a gruff former Navy man who repaired boots and leather goods, and Lisa Park, a cheerful grandmother who handled dry cleaning and starch services for dress uniforms. Rebecca's workshop was functional and sparse. 2 industrial sewing machines that had been cutting edge during the Clinton administration. A large work table scarred by years of pins, needles, and fabric shears. Overhead lighting that cast harsh shadows but provided the illumination necessary for detailed work. A small radio that played classical music to help her concentrate during the long hours of repetitive stitching. The walls were bare, except for a regulation poster about workplace safety and a small calendar from the base commissary that she forgot to replace each January. No personal photographs that might invite questions about her life outside these gray walls. No decorations that might suggest interests beyond the technical precision required for textile repair. The morning started like every other morning in her 7 years of service. Rebecca logged into the work order system and began reviewing the overnight submissions from various departments across the installation. Torn pocket on a captain's dress uniform. Loose button on a sergeant's service coat. Hemming required for a lieutenant's trousers. Rank insignia replacement for a major who had recently received a promotion. Her job was to receive, repair, document, and return. She was a human maintenance system for the fabric and threads that held military appearance standards together. She was very good at it, working with the kind of methodical precision that meant garments returned to their owners looking better than when they had left the manufacturer. Around 9:30, her supervisor, Mr. Harold Barnes, appeared at her workshop door with a clipboard and the expression of barely contained irritation. That seemed to be his natural state. Barnes was 58, had worked in government contracting for 25 years, and treated his position as Quartermaster Services Coordinator like it was a cabinet appointment. He wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit, constantly reminding people that he had access to officer schedules and classified uniform specifications. "Chun, I need you to handle a rush job today," Barnes announced without preamble. "Special Operations Command is requesting immediate alterations on ceremonial dress uniforms for a high-visibility event. They need them completed by 1500 hours." Rebecca looked up from the lieutenant's trousers she had been hemming. "What kind of alterations are we talking about, Mr. Barnes?" "Approximately 12 dress uniforms requiring precision work, rank adjustments, ribbon placement modifications, and custom fitting for personnel who will be participating in a classified ceremony." Barnes consulted his clipboard with the self-importance of someone reading classified intelligence briefings. "The uniforms are currently stored in the secure fitting room upstairs. You'll need to work there because the materials cannot leave the designated secure area." Rebecca calculated quickly. Even working efficiently, 12 dress uniforms requiring custom alterations would normally take at least 2 days to complete properly. Each uniform required individual fitting, precise measurements, and the kind of detailed work that could not be rushed without compromising quality. "When do they need this completed?" "Today. The ceremony is tomorrow morning, and they need the uniforms ready for final inspection by 1600 hours. Barnes's tone suggested that questioning the timeline was both inappropriate and futile. "The uniforms are in Fitting Room Alpha in the Special Operations Wing. You'll need to work there because the materials are classified as sensitive equipment." Fitting Room Alpha was located in the heart of the Special Operations Command building, several floors above Rebecca's usual domain and considerably closer to the installation centers of power. It was where elite personnel were fitted for specialized gear, where tactical decisions required perfect uniformity, and where people with serious responsibilities wore clothing that reflected the gravity of their missions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca had never worked in that area before. Her security clearance gave her access to the building, but she had never had reason to venture beyond the service corridors and basement, workshops where contractors like her performed their invisible labor. "Will I be working alone?" "Yes, the room has been reserved for this project exclusively. Just bring your equipment and get started. Badge access has been updated to include the secure areas you'll need." Barnes turned to leave, then paused, as if remembering something important. "And Chun, try to keep a low profile up there. That area is for operational personnel. Don't wander around, don't ask questions, and don't draw attention to yourself. Focus on the work and nothing else." An hour later, Rebecca stood outside Fitting Room Alpha, balancing her canvas bag of tools and a folder of work orders. The Special Operations Command building felt different from her usual workspace. The corridors were wider and cleaner. The lighting was brighter and more modern. The walls displayed photographs of successful missions, maps of global deployments, and portraits of personnel who had distinguished themselves in ways that made national security possible. Everything about the environment seemed designed to remind visitors that this was where serious people accomplished serious objectives. The carpet was newer, the paint was fresher, and the air itself seemed to carry the weight of important decisions and classified operations. She used her updated badge to enter Fitting Room Alpha and found herself in a space that was clearly designed for precision work requiring the highest standards. Multiple full-length mirrors lined the walls. Professional lighting eliminated shadows that might interfere with accurate fitting. Adjustable platforms allowed for proper hemming and alterations. The room smelled faintly of fabric starch and leather conditioner, with an underlying hint of the industrial carpet cleaner used throughout the building. Along one wall, she found her assignment: a dozen dress uniforms hanging in protective garment. Bags, each tagged with detailed alteration specifications and handling restrictions. Rebecca set up her portable sewing station on the room's central work table and began the methodical process of examining each uniform to understand the scope of work required. The uniforms were beautiful in their precision and attention to detail. These were not the standard issue dress uniforms she typically worked with, but specialized ceremonial garments that represented the highest levels of military craftsmanship. The fabric was superior quality, the stitching was perfectly straight, and the hardware was polished to a mirror finish that reflected the room's professional lighting. Each uniform told a story through its ribbons, insignia, and decorations. Rebecca could read the career progression of each wearer through the careful arrangement of awards and commendations. Combat deployments, specialized training, leadership, positions, and achievements that represented years of dedicated service and sacrifice. Rebecca processed each garment with professional efficiency, but she could not help noticing the details that brought these careers to life. Hand-stitched insignia that indicated elite unit membership. Ribbon arrangements that spoke of deployments to dangerous locations. Rank insignia that represented responsibility for decisions that affected national security and human lives. By lunchtime, she had made significant progress through the first half of the uniforms. The work was familiar, though the quality of the materials and the precision required made everything feel more significant. Through the fitting room's windows, she could see the installation's main parade ground where personnel moved between buildings with the purposeful stride of people engaged in important work. Around 1 o'clock, Rebecca became aware of voices in the corridor outside. Not unusual in itself, the Special Operations Command building was busy with personnel moving between meetings, briefings, and training exercises. But these voices carried the kind of authority that made people straighten their posture and pay attention when they passed. She glanced up from the colonel's dress uniform she was altering as the door opened and 3 men in military fatigues entered the room, deep in conversation about equipment specifications and deployment schedules. The conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed Rebecca sitting at the work table, surrounded by dress uniforms, and obviously not where they expected to find her. The 3 men stood frozen in the doorway, clearly not expecting to find anyone in what they had assumed would be an empty fitting room. Rebecca looked up from her sewing machine, took in their uniforms and bearing, and immediately recognized the kind of authority that came with years of operational experience and enough rank to influence policy at the installation level. The man in the center was tall and lean, with graying hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. His uniform bore the insignia of a lieutenant colonel with enough ribbons and decorations to indicate extensive field experience. To his left stood a younger captain, probably in his early 30s, with the alert eyes and precise movements of someone with special operations background. The third man was a master sergeant whose weathered face suggested years of training. Personnel for missions that most people never heard about. "Excuse me," the lieutenant colonel said, his voice carrying the kind of polite authority that made it clear this was not actually a request. "I think there might be some confusion here. This room is reserved for a classified equipment inspection." Rebecca saved her work and looked up from the sewing machine. "I'm sorry for any confusion, sir. I'm Rebecca Chun from Quartermaster Services. I was assigned to work in here today on alterations for dress uniforms needed for tomorrow's ceremony. My supervisor said the room was reserved for this project. The lieutenant colonel exchanged glances with his companions, clearly trying to process why a civilian contractor was working unsupervised with what appeared to be classified ceremonial equipment. Quartermaster services. Who authorized you to work with these specific uniforms? Mr. Barnes, my supervisor. Special Operations Command requested immediate alterations for personnel participating in tomorrow's classified ceremony. Rebecca gestured to the uniforms hanging around the room. I have the work orders if you need to see them. The captain stepped forward, his expression skeptical and slightly concerned. Ma'am, these are specialized ceremonial uniforms for highly classified operations personnel. Are you certain you have the appropriate security clearance for handling this equipment? Rebecca felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she experienced whenever her qualifications were questioned, based on her appearance and position rather than her actual capabilities. Yes, sir. I have secret clearance with special access. I've been handling similar materials for 7 years, without any security incidents or protocol violations. The master sergeant was studying the uniforms Rebecca had been working with, his expression growing more concerned as he examined the detailed alterations she had completed. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, some of these uniforms belong to personnel whose identities are classified. I'm not comfortable with them being handled by. He paused, clearly searching for diplomatically appropriate phrasing. By personnel who might not fully understand the operational security implications. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson nodded thoughtfully, but his expression suggested growing concern about the situation he had discovered. I appreciate your dedication, Miss Chun, but I think there may have been a miscommunication about the sensitivity of these materials. Perhaps you could return to your regular duties while we sort this out with your supervisor. Rebecca felt her jaw tighten slightly. She had been working with classified materials for years, had undergone extensive background investigations, and had never had a security incident or breach of any kind. But she recognized the tone in Lieutenant Colonel Davidson's voice. It was the same tone she had heard countless times over the past 7 years. The gentle but firm dismissal that came from people who saw her contractor badge and her basement workshop assignment and made immediate assumptions about her capabilities and trustworthiness. Sir, I understand your concerns, but I have explicit authorization to be here. Rebecca kept her voice level and professional. Mr. Barnes can verify that this project was requested by Special Operations Command specifically. I'm experienced with this type of work, and the timeline is quite tight. The ceremony is tomorrow morning, and these uniforms need to be ready for final inspection by 1600 hours. The captain pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be his calendar and contact list. Lieutenant Colonel, we're supposed to have this room for the equipment inspection in 30 minutes. Colonel Martinez and Sergeant Major Thompson are expecting to review the operational gear configurations for tomorrow's mission. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson's expression hardened slightly as he realized that multiple priorities were colliding in a way that could affect tomorrow's classified ceremony. Miss Chun, I'm going to need you to pack up your materials and find somewhere else to work. This room is needed for operational briefings and, frankly, the presence of unauthorized personnel during sensitive equipment reviews is a security concern. Unauthorized. Rebecca stood up slowly, feeling a familiar anger building in her chest, though she fought to keep it from showing in her voice or posture. Sir, I'm not unauthorized. I have proper clearance, explicit work orders, and badge access that was specifically updated for this assignment. The uniforms I'm working on are needed for tomorrow's ceremony, and relocating this work would violate the security protocols that require these materials to remain in designated secure areas. The Master Sergeant was now examining Rebecca's portable sewing station and the specialized tools she had brought for the precision alterations. These uniforms contain operational details and unit identifications that are classified above the level of most support personnel. Even if you have general secret clearance, that doesn't necessarily mean you have need to know for specific operational information. Rebecca realized that what had started as a simple scheduling conflict was escalating into something more problematic. The three military personnel were clearly convinced that she didn't belong in this room working with these uniforms, and they were beginning to treat her presence as a potential security violation rather than a legitimate work assignment. "Gentlemen, I think you should contact Mr. Barnes in Quartermaster Services to verify this assignment," Rebecca said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the growing tension in the room. "I'm sure we can resolve this confusion quickly without disrupting anyone's schedule or compromising the ceremony preparations." Lieutenant Colonel Davidson was already reaching for the secure phone mounted on the fitting room wall. "I think that's exactly what we need to do. In the meantime, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the uniforms until we can verify your authorization and need-to-know status." Rebecca felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. She had seen this dynamic before, though never in quite this context. People in positions of authority making assumptions based on limited information, then doubling down on those assumptions when challenged. The fact that she was right, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be doing exactly what she was authorized to do, would become irrelevant once they decided she was a problem to be solved. "Sir, I understand your position, but I need to continue working," Rebecca said, gesturing to the uniforms that still required hours of detailed alterations. "This project has a firm deadline, and I've already invested significant time in organizing and fitting these garments. I'm happy to coordinate with your inspection schedule, but I cannot simply abandon an assignment because of scheduling conflicts." The captain's expression had shifted from skeptical to openly suspicious. "Ma'am, your insistence on remaining here despite our security concerns is itself concerning. Most support personnel would be eager to avoid potential complications with operational staff." The implication was clear, and Rebecca felt her professional composure beginning to crack under the pressure of assumptions and accusations that had no basis in fact. They weren't just questioning her authorization anymore. They were questioning her motives, transforming her from a misplaced contractor into a potential security risk, who was suspiciously determined to remain in a room full of classified materials. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson finished his phone call and turned back to the group with an expression that suggested the situation had become more complicated rather than less. "I've left a message for Mr. Barnes, but he's apparently in budget meetings for the rest of the afternoon. Until we can verify this assignment and your specific authorization for these materials, I'm going to have to insist that you gather your equipment and relocate." Rebecca looked at the uniforms hanging around the room, calculated the hours of work she would lose if forced to pack everything up and start over elsewhere, and made a decision that would change everything. The security protocols require these uniforms to remain in designated secure areas. If you're ordering me to move them to an unsecured location, I need that instruction in writing from someone with the authority to override established security procedures. The room fell completely silent except for the hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sounds of installation operations continuing beyond the fitting room door. Rebecca could see the moment when their confusion turned to anger, when a minor scheduling conflict became something much more serious. The lines had been drawn, and there was no going back. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson's face darkened to a shade that suggested Rebecca had just crossed a line that most people knew better than to approach. The captain took a step closer, his hand instinctively moving toward the radio clipped to his belt. The master sergeant was already pulling out his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen in what Rebecca recognized as the beginning of an escalation protocol. "Miss Chun," Lieutenant Colonel Davidson's voice had dropped to the kind of controlled tone that experienced military personnel used when they were containing their anger through sheer force of will. "I don't think you understand the gravity of what you just said. This is a military installation, and when senior personnel give you direction, you comply. Period. Rebecca remained standing beside her sewing station, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She had been in situations like this before, though never quite in this context or with these stakes. Sir, with respect, you're not my commanding officer. I'm a civilian contractor with specific work assignments, and I have just as much right to be in this room as anyone else with proper authorization. The captain finished his radio call and turned back to the group with obvious urgency. Security is en route, Lieutenant Colonel. Do you want me to contact Colonel Martinez's office? If we're dealing with a potential security incident involving classified ceremonial equipment, he's going to want to know about it immediately. Rebecca felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications of what was happening. Colonel Martinez was the installation's director of special operations, a full colonel whose name appeared on high-level operational briefings and classified mission reports. Having her work assignment escalated to a colonel's attention was exactly the kind of visibility that could destroy her career and potentially her security clearance. But backing down now would mean abandoning not just her work assignment, but her right to be treated with basic professional respect. That won't be necessary, Rebecca said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. This is a simple administrative matter that can be resolved with one phone call to my supervisor. There's no need to involve Colonel Martinez in a scheduling confusion. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson's laugh was devoid of any humor whatsoever. Miss Chen, this stopped being a scheduling confusion the moment you refused a direct instruction to vacate this room. You've now made this a matter of facility security and contractor compliance with lawful orders. The fitting room door opened, and two installation security officers entered, their presence immediately changing the dynamic in the room. Both were military police with the kind of bearing that suggested they had dealt with much more serious situations than contractor disputes, but they also carried themselves with the professional alertness of people who knew that small problems could quickly become large ones if not handled properly. The senior officer, a staff sergeant with close-cropped hair and intelligent eyes, approached Lieutenant Colonel Davidson with professional deference while simultaneously assessing the situation around him. Sir, we received a report of a potential security incident involving unauthorized access to classified materials. How can we assist? Lieutenant Colonel Davidson gestured toward Rebecca with obvious frustration. Sergeant Williams, the civilian. Contractor is refusing to comply with instructions to remove herself from the secure area. She's currently in possession of highly classified ceremonial uniforms, and we've been unable to verify her authorization to access these specific materials. Rebecca watched as Sergeant Williams's expression shifted from routine inquiry to focused attention. She could see him taking in the scene uniforms hanging around the room, her sewing equipment, three senior personnel clearly agitated by her presence. In his experience, situations like this usually had obvious solutions, and people who refused to cooperate with military authority typically had something to hide. Ma'am, Sergeant Williams addressed Rebecca with professional courtesy that carried an underlying firmness. I'm going to need to see your identification and security credentials. Can you also provide documentation of your work authorization for these materials? Rebecca reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out her contractor ID badge, then accessed her work order folder to display the assignment Mr. Barnes had provided. Sergeant, I'm Rebecca Chun, textile specialist with Quartermaster Services. I was assigned to complete alterations on these ceremonial uniforms for tomorrow's classified ceremony. My clearance level is secret with special access, and my badge authorization was specifically updated this morning to include this secure area. Sergeant Williams examined her credentials carefully, then studied the work orders in her folder. Rebecca could see him processing the information, trying to reconcile what appeared to be legitimate authorization with the obvious concerns of three senior Military personnel who clearly believed she didn't belong in this room. "Ma'am, your credentials appear to be in order," Sergeant Williams said slowly, but his tone suggested that wasn't the end of the analysis. "However, these gentlemen have raised concerns about the appropriateness of your access to these specific uniforms. Until we can verify the details of your assignment with your supervisory chain, I think it would be appropriate for you to secure your materials and relocate to a non-sensitive area." Rebecca felt the institutional machinery grinding into motion around her, the same machinery that always assumed the people with the highest rank must be right and that contractors like her must be wrong. The default assumption was so automatic that even security personnel trained to evaluate evidence objectively were deferring to rank rather than examining the actual facts of the situation. "Sergeant, I understand the concern, but relocating these materials would violate the security protocols that require them to remain in designated secure areas," Rebecca explained, gesturing to the uniforms around the room. "These are classified ceremonial uniforms that cannot be removed from this fitting room. If I pack them up and move somewhere else, I'd be creating the exact kind of security violation everyone is supposedly trying to prevent." The second security officer, a younger corporal, had been examining the uniforms and now looked up with obvious concern about the situation he was witnessing. "Sergeant Williams, she's right about the handling restrictions. These uniforms are marked for secure area. Access only. Moving them to a general work area would definitely be a protocol violation." Lieutenant Colonel Davidson's patience was clearly exhausted, and his voice carried the edge of someone who was tired of having his authority questioned by people he considered subordinate. "Then we'll secure the uniforms and suspend the project until proper authorization can be verified. Sergeant Williams, I want these materials locked down and this area cleared immediately." Rebecca realized that she was watching her work assignment being dismantled in real time. Hours of careful fitting and precise alterations would be lost. The tight deadline would be missed. And worst of all, she would be branded as someone who couldn't handle sensitive assignments without creating security incidents and interpersonal conflicts. The unfairness of it hit her like a physical blow, but she also recognized that she was facing a choice that would define not just this situation, but how she would be treated for the rest of her career. She could accept the dismissal and the implicit message that her place was in the basement workshop, or she could continue to stand her ground and face whatever consequences came from challenging the assumption that rank always trumped legitimacy. "Sir, you're punishing me for following my authorized assignment because it's inconvenient for your inspection schedule," Rebecca said, her voice carrying an edge that made everyone in the room pay closer attention to what she was saying. "I've done nothing wrong, violated no protocols, and followed every security procedure exactly as required. The only problem here is that you didn't expect to find me in this room, and you've decided that your expectations are more important than my legitimate work assignment." The captain stepped forward, his expression darkening with each word Rebecca spoke. "Ma'am, you need to check your attitude. Regardless of your work assignment, you're speaking to senior military officers who have legitimate concerns about operational security. Your combative response is inappropriate and concerning." Rebecca felt something cold settle in her chest. She had heard variations of this speech before in different contexts and different uniforms, but always with the same underlying message. Know your place. Accept your position. Don't challenge authority even when authority is wrong. The fact that she was right became irrelevant once they decided she was the problem. "I'm not being combative," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "I'm trying to complete an assignment I was given by my supervisor using authorization I was properly granted in a room I have legitimate access to. If that seems combative to you, perhaps the problem isn't with my attitude." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sounds of installation operations continuing beyond the fitting room door. Rebecca could see the moment when Lieutenant Colonel Davidson's annoyance transformed into something more serious. She had just challenged not only his specific instructions, but the entire assumption that his rank gave him the right to override her legitimate work assignment. Sergeant Williams was speaking quietly into his radio, and Rebecca caught fragments of phrases that made her stomach clench. Elevated security concern. Non-cooperative civilian personnel. Request supervisory response. The machinery of institutional authority was grinding into motion, and she was about to be crushed beneath it. Within minutes, the fitting room had transformed from a quiet workspace into what felt like a crisis management center. 2 additional officers had arrived in response to Sergeant Williams's radio call. Major Sarah Collins from Installation Security and Captain James Rodriguez from Operations Planning, both carrying themselves with the brisk efficiency of people accustomed to handling problems that threatened to spiral out of control. Major Collins was a woman in her early 40s with auburn hair pulled into a regulation bun and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had spent her career navigating male-dominated environments through sheer competence and unwillingness to back down. She surveyed the scene with practiced efficiency, taking in the ceremonial uniforms, Rebecca's sewing equipment, and the obvious tension radiating from everyone present. "Gentlemen, I understand we have a situation involving unauthorized access to classified ceremonial equipment," Collins said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with far more serious security breaches than contractor disputes. "Can someone provide me with a concise summary of the circumstances?" Lieutenant Colonel Davidson stepped forward, clearly relieved to have someone of equivalent rank to handle what he obviously considered an increasingly troublesome situation. "Major Collins, we discovered this civilian contractor working unsupervised with highly classified ceremonial uniforms. When we questioned her authorization and requested that she relocate to accommodate a scheduled equipment inspection, she became argumentative and refused to comply with our instructions." Rebecca felt her face flush with anger at the characterization, but she forced herself to remain calm. "That's not what happened, ma'am. I was assigned to work in this room by my supervisor to complete alterations for tomorrow's ceremony. When these officers arrived for an unscheduled inspection, I explained my assignment and offered to coordinate with their schedule. I only refused to leave when Lieutenant Colonel Davidson demanded that I abandon my authorized work without any verification of his authority to override my assignment." Captain Rodriguez had been examining Rebecca's sewing equipment and the work orders she had displayed. "Ma'am, according to these documents, this project was requested by Special Operations Command, but I can't find any record of our division making such a request. Our standard protocol for ceremonial uniform alterations involves specialized contractors with enhanced security clearances, not general textile specialists." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the implications of what Rodriguez was suggesting. "Captain, the work order came directly from Mr. Barnes in Quartermaster Services. He said Special Operations Command had requested immediate alterations for tomorrow's classified ceremony." Major Collins picked up one of the uniforms Rebecca had been working with and examined the rank, insignia, and ribbon arrangements with obvious concern. "Miss Chun, these are ceremonial uniforms for highly classified operations personnel. Some of these ribbons and decorations indicate participation in missions that are still classified at the highest levels. Are you certain you have the appropriate clearance level and need to know authorization for this specific material?" Rebecca pulled up her security clearance documentation from her work folder. "Yes, ma'am. I have secret clearance with special access. I've been processing similar materials for 7 years without any security incidents or protocol violations. My supervisor assured me that this assignment was within my authorization parameters." Lieutenant Colonel Davidson was examining one of the uniforms Rebecca had already altered, his expression growing more concerned as he studied the precision of her work. "Major Collins, look at this. This particular uniform belongs to personnel involved in operations that I was directly briefed on last month. The ribbon arrangements and unit identifications on this uniform are so sensitive that even some of the officers in our division don't have access to the complete operational details. Rebecca realized with growing alarm that the discussion was shifting from her authorization to process uniforms to questions about her right to access specific operational details that were embedded in the ceremonial decorations. Ma'am, I'm not analyzing these uniforms for content. I'm altering them for fit and appearance. My job is to adjust seams and replace buttons, not to interpret the meaning of ribbons and insignia. Captain Rodriguez looked up from his phone with an expression of growing concern. Major Collins, I just checked with our ceremonial events office. They have no record of any classified ceremonies scheduled for tomorrow, and there's no record of any urgent alteration requests from our division. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation settled over everyone present. Rebecca felt her stomach drop as she realized that her entire assignment might be based on miscommunication or misinformation. But even worse was the growing suspicion she could see in the eyes of the officers around her. Miss Chun, Major Collins said, her voice taking on a more serious tone that made Rebecca's chest tighten with apprehension. Can you think of any reason why you might have been given inaccurate information about this assignment? Is it possible that someone wanted you to have access to these specific uniforms for reasons unrelated to ceremonial preparations? Rebecca stared at Collins in disbelief as the implication of the question hit her like a slap. Ma'am, are you suggesting that I somehow arranged to be given access to classified uniforms under false pretenses? I received this assignment from my supervisor this morning. I have no control over the requests that come to our division or the work orders that get generated. Sergeant Williams had been listening to the conversation with increasing concern about the direction it was taking. Ma'am, if there's any question about the legitimacy of this assignment, I recommend we secure all materials immediately and initiate a formal security review until we can verify the circumstances that led to this situation. We should treat this as a potential security incident. Rebecca felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she watched what had started as a scheduling conflict transform into a potential security breach with her as the primary suspect. The fact that she had done nothing wrong was becoming irrelevant in the face of institutional suspicion and automatic assumptions about her motives. Major Collins, I've worked in this installation for 7 years without a single security incident, Rebecca said, trying to keep her voice level despite the panic building in her chest. I have no reason to seek unauthorized access to classified information, and I certainly wouldn't do it in such an obvious way if that was my intention. Captain Rodriguez was now scrolling through what appeared to be personnel records on his secure tablet, his expression suggesting he was finding information that concerned him. Ma'am, according to our database, Miss Chun has standard contractor clearance for routine classified materials, but some of these uniforms contain operational details that are classified well above her normal access level. Even if her assignment was legitimate, there may have been an error in the scope of materials she was given access to. Rebecca realized that even if she could prove her assignment was legitimate, she was still going to be blamed for processing uniforms that someone had decided were above her clearance level. The system was designed to protect itself by finding fault with the lowest-ranking person available, regardless of the actual facts of the situation. Major Collins was now examining Rebecca's security credentials more carefully, studying the clearance documentation with the scrutiny of someone looking for problems rather than confirming legitimacy. Miss Chun, I noticed that your current clearance was last updated 4 years ago. Have you had any changes in your personal circumstances, financial situation, or foreign contacts that might affect your security status? The question hit Rebecca like a physical blow as she realized the direction of the investigation. Collins was following standard security review protocols, but the implication was clear. They were now investigating her as a potential security risk rather than trying to resolve a simple administrative confusion. Every aspect of her life was now subject to scrutiny and suspicion. No, ma'am. No changes in my personal circumstances. That would affect my security clearance. I undergo periodic reinvestigation just like every other cleared contractor, and I've never had any issues identified during those reviews. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson was gathering the uniforms Rebecca had been working with, clearly preparing to remove them from her access, regardless of the impact on tomorrow's ceremony. Major Collins, regardless of how this situation developed, I think we need to suspend this project immediately until we can conduct a thorough review. The sensitivity of these materials requires that we err on the side of caution. Rebecca watched as hours of careful work were dismantled before her eyes. More importantly, she was watching her professional reputation being destroyed by people who had decided she was guilty of something without bothering to determine what that something might be. The unfairness of it was overwhelming, but she also recognized the futility of arguing with an institutional mindset that had already reached its conclusions. Sir, I understand your concerns, but I hope you'll verify my assignment with Mr. Barnes before making any permanent decisions about my security status, Rebecca said, trying to maintain her professional composure. I came to work this morning expecting to complete a routine contractor assignment, not to find myself under investigation for doing exactly what I was told to do. Major Collins closed Rebecca's work folder and began gathering her sewing equipment with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Miss Chun, until we can sort this out, I'm going to have to ask you to report to the security office for a formal interview. This situation has raised enough questions that we need to document everything thoroughly. Rebecca realized that she was now facing the prospect of a formal security investigation that could result in the loss of her clearance, her job, and her ability to work anywhere in the defense industry. All because she had tried to complete an assignment and had refused to be pushed around by people who assumed she didn't belong where she had every right to be. The security office was located in the basement level of Building C, in a section that most contractors never saw and hoped never to visit. Rebecca walked between Sergeant Williams and Corporal Jackson, acutely aware that her escort through the installations corridors was drawing curious stares from colleagues and strangers alike. Word traveled fast in military installations, and by the time they reached the elevator, she could already hear whispered conversations following in their wake. "Isn't that the seamstress from Quartermaster?" she heard someone murmur as they passed a group of junior enlisted personnel near the cafeteria entrance. "I heard she was caught with classified uniforms she wasn't supposed to have access to." Rebecca kept her eyes forward, fighting the urge to turn around and correct the growing mythology that was already transforming her contractor dispute into something far more sinister. She could feel her professional reputation crumbling in real time, spread through the installation's informal communication network that was faster and more efficient than any official announcement system. The security office occupied a series of windowless rooms designed to be as intimidating as possible. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, and the kind of institutional furniture that suggested comfort was not a priority. Rebecca was directed to Interview Room C, where she found herself facing Captain Michelle Parker from Installation Security and Chief Warrant Officer Robert Kim from Criminal Investigation Command. Captain Parker was younger than Rebecca had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested she had earned her position through competence rather than connections. Chief Kim was older, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years investigating everything from minor security violations to major espionage cases. Both studied Rebecca with the professional detachment of investigators who had learned not to make assumptions about guilt or innocence, but who also understood that people didn't end up in interview rooms by accident. "Miss Chen, Thank you for your cooperation, Captain Parker began, consulting a thick folder that had apparently been assembled in the short time since Rebecca's detention. We understand this situation may seem confusing to you, but we need to thoroughly document the circumstances that led to your presence in Fitting Room Alpha with highly classified ceremonial materials. Rebecca settled into the uncomfortable metal chair across from the investigators, fighting to maintain her composure. Captain, I'm happy to cooperate, but I hope you understand that I've done nothing wrong. I was completing an assignment given to me by my supervisor using access permissions that were properly authorized through normal channels. Chief Kim leaned forward slightly, his expression neutral but attentive. Ma'am, we've conducted preliminary interviews with the officers who discovered you in the fitting room. Their account suggests that you were not only resistant to their concerns, but became increasingly argumentative when they questioned your authorization. Rebecca felt her jaw tighten as she realized that even her investigators were operating from the assumption that she must have done something to create this problem. Chief, I was polite and professional throughout that encounter. I explained my assignment, provided documentation, and offered to coordinate with their inspection schedule. I only became firm when they demanded that I abandon my authorized work without any justification for their authority to override my assignment. Captain Parker was reviewing what appeared to be Rebecca's personnel file, studying her employment history with the kind of attention that suggested she was looking for patterns or inconsistencies. Miss Chun, according to your employment history, you've been working in textile and alteration positions for 7 years without any security incidents. Can you help us understand why this particular assignment might have created such an unusual situation? Rebecca realized that even her investigators were operating from the assumption that she must have done something to create this problem. The institutional bias was so automatic that even trained investigators were looking for her mistakes rather than examining whether the officers who had challenged her might have acted inappropriately. Captain, the only unusual aspect of this assignment was the location and the materials. I was told to work in Fitting Room Alpha because the classified uniforms couldn't be removed from the secure area. When senior officers arrived for an unscheduled inspection, they made assumptions about my presence based on my appearance and position rather than checking my authorization. Chief Kim consulted his notes with the thoroughness of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar interviews. Ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel Davidson indicates that your demeanor throughout the encounter was suspicious and that your insistence on remaining in the room, despite their security concerns, suggested inappropriate motivations for accessing classified materials. Rebecca stared at Kim in disbelief, struggling to process how her professional dedication had been reframed as suspicious behavior. Chief, my motivation for remaining in the room was to complete the work assignment I was given. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson never presented any evidence that he had authority to override my supervisor's instructions or that my presence violated any security protocols. The interview room door opened, and Major Collins entered carrying additional files and wearing an expression that suggested the situation had become more complicated rather than less. She took a seat at the table and spread several documents in front of the investigators with the efficiency of someone delivering bad news. Captain Parker, Chief Kim, I've completed preliminary interviews with the personnel involved in this incident, and we have some concerning discrepancies that need to be addressed, Collins announced with obvious reluctance. First, Special Operations. Command confirms that they made no request for ceremonial uniform alterations. Second, Mr. Barnes, Miss Chun's supervisor, is currently in a day-long contractor coordination meeting and hasn't been available to verify the circumstances of this assignment. Rebecca felt her stomach drop as the implications hit her. Without Mr. Barnes available to confirm her assignment, she had no way to prove that she had been acting on legitimate orders, rather than seeking unauthorized access to classified materials for unknown purposes. Captain Parker looked up from the new files with obvious concern. Ma'am, what's your assessment of the security implications given these developments? The uniforms Miss Chun was processing include operational details from missions involving personnel who are still deployed in sensitive locations. Collins replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone delivering classified information. Even inadvertent disclosure of some of this information could compromise ongoing operations and endanger American personnel in the field. Collins fixed Rebecca with a direct stare that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. Miss Chun, given the sensitivity of this material and the discrepancies we've uncovered, we need to understand exactly how you came to be assigned this particular work. The timeline and circumstances are beginning to raise serious questions about the legitimacy of your presence in that fitting room. Rebecca realized that the investigators were no longer trying to resolve a misunderstanding. They were building a case that assumed her guilt and required her to prove her innocence, despite the fact that she had no way to provide the verification they were demanding. Ma'am, I received this assignment through normal channels from my immediate supervisor. I had no input into what uniforms were included or what specific information they might contain. My job was to alter them for proper fit, not to read or analyze their operational significance. Chief Kim was now studying what appeared to be security footage timestamps, his expression growing more serious as he reviewed the documentation. Ma'am, according to our review, you accessed Fitting Room Alpha at 10:47 this morning and worked unsupervised with classified materials for over 3 hours before being discovered. During that time, you had unrestricted access to operational details that could be of significant value to foreign intelligence services. The implication was clear, and Rebecca felt a cold anger building in her chest as she realized where the investigation was heading. Chief, are you suggesting that I was copying or transmitting classified information? Because if you are, I demand that you examine my equipment, check my access logs, and review any security footage you have. You'll find that I did nothing except the alteration work I was assigned to perform. Major Collins opened another file with obvious reluctance. Miss Chun, we've reviewed your background investigation from your last periodic reinvestigation. The report notes that you have no military service, no family members in the military, and no previous experience with operational classified materials. Can you explain how someone with your background came to be trusted with such sensitive assignments? Rebecca realized that her lack of military experience was now being used as evidence of her unsuitability for her job, despite 7 years of exemplary performance. The investigators were constructing a narrative in which her civilian background made her inherently suspicious rather than simply different from the military personnel who dominated the installation. Ma'am, I was hired specifically because my background investigations showed that I was trustworthy and reliable. My civilian status has never been considered a liability before today. I've processed thousands of classified materials over 7 years without a single security incident or protocol violation. Captain Parker consulted her timeline notes with obvious concern about the direction the interview was taking. Miss Chun, several witnesses report that your behavior during the encounter with senior officers was confrontational, and that you seemed unusually determined to maintain access to the classified materials. How do you explain this characterization? Rebecca felt her professional composure beginning to crack under the relentless assumption that she must be guilty of something she couldn't even identify. Captain, I was determined to complete my assigned work, just like any dedicated contractor would be. If that seems suspicious to you, then perhaps the problem is with how this organization treats its civilian personnel rather than with my performance. The room fell silent as the implications of Rebecca's statement settled over the investigators. She realized that she had just challenged not only the specific accusations against her, but the entire institutional culture that automatically assumed military personnel were more trustworthy than civilians who performed equally important work. Chief Kim closed his notebook with the finality of someone who had reached a conclusion. "Ma'am, given the serious nature of these security concerns and your inability to provide independent verification of your assignment, we're going to have to suspend your security clearance pending a full investigation." Rebecca felt the ground disappear beneath her feet as the weight of those words hit her. Without her security clearance, she couldn't perform her job, couldn't work anywhere in the defense industry, and would be branded as a security risk for the rest of her career. All because she had tried to complete an assignment and had refused to be bullied by officers who assumed she didn't belong where she had every right to be. But as Chief Kim reached for the suspension paperwork, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She slowly reached for the sleeve of her gray cardigan and began rolling it up past her elbow, revealing something that had remained hidden for the 7 years she had worked at this installation. "Chief, before you sign those papers, I think you should know something about my background that didn't come up during your review of my personnel file. Information that might change your assessment of whether I'm a security risk or a security asset." Chief Kim looked up from his paperwork with obvious skepticism as Rebecca continued rolling up her sleeve. "Ma'am, we've conducted a thorough review of your background investigation. Unless you're about to confess to activities that weren't disclosed during your clearance process, I don't think there's anything that would change our security assessment." Rebecca pushed her sleeve up past her elbow, revealing her forearm for the first time since entering the installation that morning. The tattoo was intricate but small, a detailed rendering of crossed needles surrounded by precise geometric patterns. Below the needles, in military-style script, were the letters EOD and the date, June 3, 2016. Above the design, almost hidden within the decorative elements, was a small bomb disposal unit insignia. The room fell completely silent. Chief Kim stared at Rebecca's arm with an expression of growing confusion, clearly recognizing that the tattoo was military in nature, but not understanding its full significance. Captain Parker leaned forward to get a better look, her investigator instincts telling her that something important had just been revealed. Major Collins, however, had gone completely pale. She was staring at Rebecca's tattoo with the kind of recognition that comes from personal familiarity with specialized military units and their traditions. Her hands, which had been reaching for the clearance suspension paperwork, froze in mid-motion. "Ma'am," Chief Kim said slowly, his voice carrying uncertainty for the first time during the interview. "Can you explain the significance of that tattoo?" Rebecca looked directly at Major Collins, who was still staring at her forearm with dawning comprehension and what appeared to be growing apprehension. "Chief, that tattoo represents my service with the 789th Explosive Ordnance Disposal Company. During my deployment to Afghanistan from 2015 to 2017, the date commemorates a particular mission involving an improvised explosive device that had been rigged inside a high-ranking Taliban commander's clothing." Captain Parker was now studying Rebecca with completely different eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. "Miss Chun, are you telling us that you're a military veteran? Because your personnel file clearly indicates no prior military service." Rebecca carefully rolled her sleeve back down, covering the tattoo that had remained hidden for over 6 years of civilian employment. "Captain, my military service was conducted under a classified program that doesn't appear in standard personnel records. After my discharge, I was advised to maintain operational security by not disclosing my service unless absolutely necessary for security or employment purposes." Major Collins finally found her voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. "Miss Chun, the 789th EOD Company conducted some of the most dangerous explosive disposal operations in Afghanistan. If you're claiming service with that unit, you're talking about missions that involved disarming devices that could have killed hundreds of people." Rebecca nodded slowly, her demeanor shifting subtly to something that the military personnel in The room recognized as the bearing of someone who had faced death repeatedly and survived. Yes, ma'am. I'm fully aware of the classification levels associated with EOD operations. I'm also aware that my service record is restricted access and would not have appeared during standard background investigations for civilian employment. Chief Kim was now looking at Rebecca with a mixture of confusion and growing respect, as if trying to reconcile the quiet seamstress with the image of someone who had spent years defusing bombs in a combat zone. Ma'am, can you provide verification of this military service? Because if what you're saying is true, it significantly changes our assessment of your background and your authorization to handle classified materials. Rebecca pulled out her phone and scrolled to a secure application that she hadn't accessed in years. Chief, I can provide you with a contact number for Master Sergeant Patricia Williams at the Army EOD School. She maintains the restricted personnel records for classified explosive ordnance disposal veterans. She can verify my service and my current security status. Major Collins was studying Rebecca with entirely new eyes, as if every assumption she had made about her had just been proven wrong. Miss Chun, why didn't you disclose this information when we began questioning your background and qualifications for handling sensitive materials? Rebecca felt a bitter smile cross her face as she considered how to explain years of deliberate invisibility. Ma'am, because I learned a long time ago that my military service tends to create more problems than it solves. Most people have assumptions about female EAD veterans that are just as limiting as their assumptions about civilian seamstresses. I found it easier to let my work speak for itself rather than dealing with people's preconceptions about who I used to be. Captain Parker was now reviewing Rebecca's actions throughout the day with completely different context, realizing that her behavior made perfect sense for someone with extensive experience handling dangerous situations under pressure. Miss Chun, if you have explosive ordnance disposal background, that would explain your familiarity with classified materials and your comfort level working in high-security environments. Rebecca nodded, feeling the weight of memories she had spent years trying to suppress. Captain, it would also explain why I was confident in my authorization to work with those uniforms and why I refused to be intimidated by officers who assumed I didn't belong in that fitting room. I've been handling classified information at the highest levels since I was 25 years old, and I've defused bombs that were designed to kill people much more important than anyone in this building. The revelation hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance itself, reshaping everyone's understanding of the entire situation. Rebecca could see the investigators realizing that they had been treating a decorated, explosive ordnance disposal veteran like a potential security risk, that their assumptions about her background and qualifications had been completely wrong. Chief Kim closed his suspension paperwork without signing it, his expression showing the kind of professional embarrassment that comes from discovering a major error in judgment. Ma'am, I think we need to contact Master Sergeant Williams immediately and verify this information before we proceed with any security actions. Major Collins reached for the secure phone mounted on the interview room wall with hands that Rebecca noticed were not entirely steady. The Major's entire demeanor had shifted from professional skepticism to something approaching concern about the career implications of what had just been revealed. Master Sergeant Williams, this is Major Sarah Collins, Installation Security. I need immediate verification of classified personnel records for a security matter involving potential compromise of sensitive materials. Collins paused, listening to the response. Yes, ma'am. I understand the protocols. The individual in question claimed service with the 789th Explosive Ordnance Disposal Company, Afghanistan deployment 2015 to 2017. Rebecca watched Collins provide her personal information over the secure line, including details that only someone with legitimate EAD service would know. Service number, deployment locations, and specialized training certifications that Rebecca had memorized, but hadn't spoken aloud in over 6 years. The other investigators waited in tense silence, clearly aware that the next few minutes would either validate Rebecca's claims or expose them as an elaborate deception that would make the security situation exponentially worse. "Yes, ma'am. She's present in the interview room now. Would you like to speak with her directly?" Collins extended the phone toward Rebecca with obvious reluctance. "Master Sergeant Williams would like to verify your identity personally." Rebecca took the phone with steady hands. "Master Sergeant Williams, this is Rebecca Chun, former Staff Sergeant, 789th EOD Company. Service number 847921465. Deployed Bagram Air Base. July 2015 through September 2017. The voice that came through the secure line was crisp, authoritative, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to dealing with the most dangerous and sensitive military operations. "Staff Sergeant Chun, I need you to provide verification details that would only be known to someone with legitimate EOD service. Can you tell me the operational designation for the mission, commemorated by the date on your unit tattoo?" Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, remembering details she had spent years trying to forget. "Operation Threadbare, ma'am. Counterterrorism. Operation targeting a high-value individual who had been using clothing-based explosive devices to assassinate Afghan government officials. Mission duration 8 days. Successful completion with neutralization of 17 improvised explosive devices and capture of the primary target." Master Sergeant Williams was quiet for a moment, and Rebecca could hear the sound of computer keys as classified records were accessed. "Staff Sergeant Chun, according to my records, you received the Bronze Star with Combat V for that operation, along with the EOD badge and multiple unit citations for exceptional performance under fire. Is that correct?" Rebecca felt the familiar weight of memories she had buried beneath years of quiet civilian life. "Yes, ma'am. Along with specialized training certifications and security clearances that remain classified." "Staff Sergeant, please return the phone to Major Collins." Rebecca handed the secure phone back to Collins, who listened intently to whatever Master Sergeant Williams was telling her. Rebecca could see the Major's expression changing as she received information that was clearly far more significant than anyone in the room had anticipated. "Yes, ma'am, I understand. Thank you for the clarification." Collins hung up the phone and turned to face Rebecca with an expression that mixed professional respect with obvious discomfort about the situation they had created. "Miss Chun, Master Sergeant Williams has confirmed your military service and has authorized me to access your restricted personnel files for this security review." Captain Parker leaned forward with obvious curiosity about what had just been revealed. "Ma'am, what did Master Sergeant Williams tell you about Miss Chun's service record?" Major Collins consulted notes she had taken during the phone conversation, her voice carrying a new tone of respect that hadn't been present before. "Staff Sergeant Rebecca Chun served with distinction in one of the military's most dangerous specialties. Her service included multiple combat deployments, advanced training in explosive device analysis, and operational experience with the highest levels of classified materials and security protocols." Chief Kim was staring at Rebecca with completely different eyes, as if trying to reconcile the quiet seamstress with someone who had spent years defusing bombs designed to kill people. "Ma'am, Master Sergeant Williams also mentioned something about current security status." What did she mean by that? Collins hesitated before responding, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of what she was about to reveal. "Chief, according to Master Sergeant Williams, Staff Sergeant Chun maintains what's called Lifetime Operational Security Clearance, a designation reserved for EOD personnel who have handled devices in situations so sensitive that their security status never expires, even after discharge from active duty." Rebecca realized that the investigators were beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Far from being a potential security risk, she was someone whose background and clearance levels exceeded those of most people on the installation. including some of the officers who had questioned her authority to work with classified materials. The interview room door opened abruptly, and Lieutenant Colonel Davidson entered with Captain Rodriguez and Master Sergeant Thompson from the morning's confrontation. All three looked like men who had just received very unwelcome news about their handling of the situation. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson's face was flushed, and he avoided making direct eye contact with Rebecca as he addressed the investigators. "Major Collins, I understand there have been some developments in the security review that require immediate clarification and damage control." Collins stood to address the senior officers, her posture reflecting the gravity of what had been discovered. "Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, we have verified that Miss Chun is a decorated explosive ordnance disposal veteran with current security clearances that exceed the requirements for handling the materials she was working with this morning." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression mixing embarrassment with confusion about how the situation had developed. "Ma'am, how is that possible? Her personnel file shows no military service, and she's been working in textile services for years." Rebecca spoke for the first time since revealing her tattoo, her voice carrying a new authority that the military officers recognized immediately. "Captain, my service was conducted under classified programs that don't appear in standard personnel databases. After my discharge, I was advised to maintain operational security by not disclosing my military background unless absolutely necessary for security purposes." Master Sergeant Thompson was studying Rebecca with obvious discomfort, realizing that he had questioned the qualifications of someone whose experience with classified materials far exceeded his own. "Miss Chun, if you had EOD background, why didn't you identify yourself when we questioned your presence in the fitting room?" Rebecca felt a cold satisfaction as she watched the power dynamics that had oppressed her all morning being completely reversed. "Sergeant, because my military service is irrelevant to my current job performance. I was in that fitting room because I was assigned to be there, not because of what I did 7 years ago. I shouldn't have needed to prove my combat credentials to complete a textile assignment." Lieutenant Colonel Davidson was clearly struggling with the realization that he had challenged and attempted to remove someone whose security clearance and military background far exceeded his own in specialized areas. "Miss Chun, I owe you a significant apology. We made assumptions based on incomplete information and civilian contractor stereotypes." Rebecca stood slowly, her posture subtly shifting to something that the military personnel recognized as the bearing of someone accustomed to life or death decision-making under extreme pressure. "Lieutenant Colonel, you made assumptions based on my appearance and my current job title. You decided that a civilian seamstress couldn't possibly belong in the same room as senior military officers, regardless of my actual qualifications or authorization." Chief Kim was reviewing the morning's events with obvious embarrassment about how the investigation had developed. "Ma'am, given your background, your response to the initial challenge makes complete sense. You were reacting as someone accustomed to standing firm under pressure and completing missions regardless of obstacles." Rebecca nodded, feeling the familiar confidence that came from knowing she was right and had the credentials to prove it. "Chief, I was responding as someone who knew I had done nothing wrong and refused to be bullied into abandoning my legitimate work assignment. My EOD training taught me to complete my mission regardless of external pressure or opposition from people who didn't understand the situation." Major Collins was now reviewing the suspension paperwork that remained unsigned on the table, clearly understanding that the entire investigation had been based on false assumptions. "Miss Chun, obviously we won't be proceeding with any security actions. In fact, given your background and clearance level, you're authorized to handle materials classified well above the level of the uniforms you were working with this morning." Rebecca realized that word of her true identity would spread through the installation as quickly as the earlier rumors about her being a security risk. But this time, the story would be about senior officers who had attempted to remove a decorated explosive ordnance disposal veteran from an assignment she was overqualified to handle. Captain Rodriguez was clearly trying to process the complete reversal of the morning's events and his role in creating the situation. "Miss Chun, I don't understand. Why someone with your background would choose to work in textile services rather than in a position that utilizes your specialized training." Rebecca looked at him with the kind of direct gaze she had learned while staring down improvised explosive devices that could detonate at any moment. "Captain, I chose to work in a position where I could serve my country without having to risk my life every day. After spending 2 years defusing bombs designed to kill people, I wanted a job where success was measured by completing alterations rather than preventing explosions." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of Rebecca's statement. They were no longer dealing with a civilian contractor who had gotten above her station, but with a combat veteran who had deliberately chosen a quiet life and was now being forced to relive experiences she had spent years trying to leave behind. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly struggling with how to address someone whose service record now commanded his respect. "Miss Chun, is there anything we can do to make this situation right?" Rebecca gathered her personal items and prepared to leave the interview room that had nearly destroyed her carefully constructed civilian life. "Lieutenant Colonel, you can let me finish the work assignment I was given this morning. And maybe next time you can verify authorization before making assumptions about who belongs where." 2 years later, Rebecca stood before the installation's main auditorium, addressing a packed audience of military personnel and civilian contractors. She wore her dress uniform for the first time in over 8 years, the EOD badge gleaming on her chest alongside ribbons that told the story of courage under fire. The Rebecca Chun Award for Professional Excellence was being presented to its first recipient, a young contractor who had stood up to discrimination from senior personnel. This award exists because one person refused to accept that their current position defined their worth, Rebecca announced to thunderous applause. It reminds us that respect is earned through character and competence, not through assumptions about someone's background or appearance. In the audience, Mr. Barnes smiled proudly, remembering the quiet seamstress who had transformed into a symbol of professional courage. Major Collins, who had become an advocate for contractor rights, watched with admiration. Master Sergeant Williams had flown in specifically for the ceremony, her presence a testament to the bonds forged in combat that transcended civilian careers. Rebecca's tattoo, no longer hidden beneath her sleeve, caught the auditorium lights as she raised her hand in acknowledgement. The Chun protocol had been adopted throughout the military installation system, ensuring that civilian contractors received the same professional respect as military personnel. What had started as a simple work assignment had evolved into institutional change that affected thousands of contractors and military personnel. Rebecca's refusal to accept inappropriate treatment had inspired others to stand up for themselves, had exposed systematic problems in how civilian expertise was valued, and had created lasting reforms in military-contractor relations. Her small tattoo had indeed changed everything, but not in ways she could ever have anticipated. The lesson she had learned and was now teaching others was both simple and powerful. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their current position or appearance. Sometimes defending that principle requires the courage to reveal who you really are, even when you've spent years trying to leave that identity behind. 5 years after that transformative day in Fitting Room Alpha, Rebecca Chun walked through the corridors of the newly constructed Riverside Military Training Center with the confident stride of someone who had found her true calling. The building itself was a testament to how much had changed since her revelation, designed with input from both military personnel and civilian contractors to ensure that all essential personnel were treated with equal respect and consideration. Rebecca's office was located on the 3rd floor, with windows overlooking the training grounds where new recruits learned the fundamentals of military service. The nameplate on her door read Rebecca Chun, Director of Integrated Security Training, a position that had been created specifically to address the gaps in understanding between military and civilian personnel that her experience had exposed. Her office walls told the story of her journey from hidden EOD specialist to recognized leader in institutional reform. Framed certificates acknowledged both her military service and her civilian achievements. A photograph showed her receiving the Medal of Excellence from the Secretary of Defense for her contributions to military-civilian integration. Another picture captured the moment she had addressed Congress about the importance of recognizing diverse expertise within defense organizations. But the item that drew the most attention from visitors was a simple display case containing her old sewing tools, alongside her EOD badge and bronze star. The juxtaposition was deliberate, a reminder that expertise and value could be found in unexpected places, and that assuming someone's capabilities based on their current role was both dangerous and counterproductive. Rebecca was reviewing training curriculum proposals when her assistant knocked on the door. "Ma'am, there's a delegation here from the Department of Defense. They're conducting a review of the Chun Protocol implementation across all military installations." The Chun Protocol had become the gold standard for military-civilian integration, requiring verification of authority before challenging work assignments, establishing clear procedures for resolving access disputes, and creating protected channels for reporting discrimination. What had started as Rebecca's personal ordeal had evolved into comprehensive policy changes affecting hundreds of thousands of personnel across the entire defense establishment. The delegation was led by General Patricia Morrison, a 3-star officer who had built her career on improving organizational effectiveness and eliminating institutional barriers to mission success. She was accompanied by Dr. James Rodriguez, a civilian analyst who specialized in workplace dynamics, and Colonel Sarah Kim, who directed policy implementation for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Morrison was a woman in her late 50s whose reputation for no-nonsense leadership had earned respect throughout the military establishment. She had requested this meeting specifically to discuss expanding the Chun Protocol to include other federal agencies where similar dynamics between military and civilian personnel created operational challenges. "Ms. Chun," General Morrison began, settling into one of the chairs facing Rebecca's desk, "we've been studying the implementation of your protocol across all service branches, and the results have been remarkable. Complaints related to military-civilian discrimination have dropped by 73%. And more importantly, we're seeing significant improvements in operational efficiency when diverse teams work together effectively." Rebecca felt a deep satisfaction at hearing that her experience had resulted in measurable improvements in how people were treated throughout the defense establishment. "General, I'm pleased that the protocol has been effective, but I think the real success has been in changing institutional culture rather than just implementing new procedures." Dr. Rodriguez consulted his tablet, which contained extensive data on workplace dynamics before and after the protocol implementation. "Ms. Chun, our analysis shows that installations using your training methods have seen a 40% increase in civilian contractor retention and a significant improvement in cross-functional team performance. The economic benefits alone justify expanding this approach to other agencies." Rebecca had spent the past 5 years developing training programs that went beyond simple policy compliance to address the underlying attitudes and assumptions that created discriminatory behavior. Her approach combined scenario-based learning with real-world case studies, helping personnel understand not just what they should do, but why treating all colleagues with respect was essential for mission success. Colonel Kim was reviewing implementation reports from various installations, her expression showing genuine admiration for the breadth of change that had occurred. "Ms. Chun, We've received feedback from installation commanders indicating that the Chun protocol has become a competitive advantage in recruiting and retaining talented personnel. People want to work in environments where their contributions are valued, regardless of their background or current position. The conversation was interrupted by a call from Rebecca's assistant announcing that a special guest had arrived for the meeting. Rebecca smiled, knowing who it would be before the door opened. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams entered the office wearing dress blues that reflected her recent promotion to Sergeant Major, the highest enlisted rank in the Army, Sergeant Major. Williams had become one of Rebecca's closest collaborators in developing training programs that addressed the unique challenges faced by veterans transitioning to civilian roles within military organizations. Her expertise in EOD operations, combined with Rebecca's experience in institutional reform, had created educational approaches that helped personnel understand the diverse expertise that existed within their organizations. Sergeant Major, Rebecca said, standing to greet her former supervisor and current partner in reform efforts, "Thank you for joining us. I know General Morrison was particularly interested in hearing about the veteran integration aspects of our training programs." Williams took a seat at the conference table, her presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "General Morrison, what Ms. Chun has accomplished here goes beyond addressing discrimination. She's created a framework for recognizing and utilizing expertise that might otherwise remain hidden or undervalued." General Morrison leaned forward with obvious interest. "Sergeant Major, can you elaborate on that?" "We're always looking for ways to better leverage the skills and experience of our personnel." Williams gestured toward the display case containing Rebecca's sewing tools and military decorations. "General, Rebecca's story illustrates a fundamental problem in how we assess and assign personnel. Her EOD expertise made her uniquely qualified to work with sensitive materials. But because she chose a civilian role in textile services, that expertise was invisible until circumstances forced her to reveal it." Dr. Rodriguez was taking notes on his tablet, clearly recognizing the broader implications of what Williams was describing. "Sergeant Major, are you suggesting that there are other personnel throughout the system whose backgrounds and capabilities are not being fully utilized?" "Exactly," Williams replied with conviction. "Our research has identified hundreds of cases where veterans in civilian contractor roles possess specialized knowledge and security clearances that could benefit their organizations, but institutional assumptions prevent that expertise from being recognized or utilized effectively." Rebecca had spent considerable time developing assessment tools that could identify hidden expertise without requiring people to disclose sensitive information about their backgrounds. The goal was to create opportunities for voluntary disclosure, rather than forcing people to choose between invisibility and unwanted attention. Colonel Kim was studying the training materials Rebecca had developed, her expression showing appreciation for the complexity of the issues being addressed. "Ms. Chun, your approach seems to balance operational security with talent utilization in ways that traditional personnel management systems struggle to achieve." Rebecca nodded, remembering her own years of deliberate invisibility and the factors that had led to that choice. "Colonel, many veterans choose civilian roles, specifically because they want to serve without the pressures and expectations that come with their military backgrounds being known. Our training helps supervisors and colleagues understand how to create environments where people feel safe being honest about their capabilities." The meeting continued for another hour, with the delegation reviewing specific case studies and implementation strategies. Rebecca presented data showing that installations using comprehensive integration training had not only eliminated discriminatory behavior, but had also discovered previously unknown expertise that enhanced operational capabilities. General Morrison concluded the meeting by announcing her intention to recommend expanding the Chun Protocol to all federal agencies that employed both military and civilian personnel. Ms. Chun, your experience has created a model for institutional change that addresses both fairness and operational effectiveness. That's exactly the kind of innovation our organizations need. As the delegation prepared to leave, Sergeant Major Williams remained behind to discuss ongoing training development. The two women had formed a partnership that combined Williams's military expertise with Rebecca's institutional reform experience, creating educational programs that were being adopted throughout the defense establishment. Patricia, Rebecca said, using her former supervisor's first name in the informal way that had developed over years of collaboration. Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed since that morning in the fitting room. Williams smiled, remembering the phone call she had received 5 years earlier, when a security investigation had nearly destroyed the career of one of the most capable people she had ever supervised. Rebecca, what you accomplished wasn't just about defending yourself. You forced an entire system to examine its assumptions and biases in ways that had never happened before. Rebecca walked to her window overlooking the training grounds, where she could see mixed groups of military personnel and civilian contractors participating in integrated exercises designed to build mutual understanding and respect. The sight never failed to remind her of how far they had come and how much work remained to be done. The afternoon brought a steady stream of meetings and consultations as Rebecca continued her work developing new training approaches. A video conference with installation commanders discussing implementation challenges. A review session with curriculum developers working on advanced modules. A planning meeting for next month's national conference on military-civilian integration. Each interaction reinforced Rebecca's understanding that lasting change required constant attention and refinement. Institutional bias was not something that could be eliminated with a single policy change or training program. It required ongoing effort to identify and address the subtle ways that assumptions and stereotypes influence decision-making. Around 4 o'clock, Rebecca received a call that brought her day full circle. Mr. Barnes, her former supervisor at Quartermaster Services, was on the line with news about a situation developing at another installation that seemed eerily familiar to her own experience years earlier. Rebecca, Barnes said, his voice carrying the kind of urgency that suggested he was dealing with a crisis. We have a civilian contractor at Fort Stevens who's being challenged for working with classified materials. The circumstances are almost identical to what happened to you, but this person doesn't have your background to fall back on. Rebecca felt her chest tighten as she realized that despite all the progress they had made, the fundamental dynamics that had nearly destroyed her career were still occurring at installations that hadn't fully implemented the new protocols. What's the contractor's background? Barnes consulted his notes. Jennifer Martinez, electronics technician, 15 years of experience with classified systems. She was assigned to repair communications equipment in a secure facility when senior officers questioned her authorization and demanded that she leave. When she refused, they initiated a security investigation. Rebecca knew immediately that this was exactly the kind of situation the Chun Protocol was designed to prevent, but it also illustrated the ongoing challenge of ensuring that policy changes translated into actual behavioral changes throughout the vast defense establishment. Harold, Rebecca said, using her former supervisor's first name, I want you to contact the Installation Security Office immediately and reference Chun Protocol. Procedures. Martinez has the right to have her authorization verified before being removed from her assigned work area. Rebecca spent the next 2 hours coordinating with Fort Stevens personnel to ensure that Jennifer Martinez received the protection and due process that the Chun Protocol guaranteed. By the end of the day, Martinez had been cleared to continue. Her work and the officers who had challenged her had been enrolled in mandatory integration training. But the incident served as a reminder that Rebecca's work was far from finished. Changing policies was relatively easy compared to changing the deeply ingrained attitudes and assumptions that created discriminatory behavior in the first place. That evening, Rebecca attended a reception for military and civilian personnel at the Officers Club, an event that would have been unthinkable when she was working in basement workshops and hiding her identity. The gathering was specifically designed to build relationships across organizational boundaries and ensure that all personnel felt valued and included. As she moved through the crowd, Rebecca encountered people whose lives had been touched by the changes her experience had initiated. A young contractor who had been promoted to a supervisory position after her expertise was recognized. A veteran who had been able to transition successfully to civilian employment without losing the respect of his military colleagues. A female officer who had used Chun protocol procedures to address discrimination she had faced from senior personnel. Each conversation reinforced Rebecca's understanding that individual courage could create institutional change, but only when that courage was channeled into systematic efforts to address root causes rather than just symptoms. Near the end of the evening, Rebecca found herself in conversation with a group of junior officers who were discussing leadership challenges they faced in managing diverse teams. Their questions showed genuine interest in understanding how to create inclusive environments that maximized everyone's contributions. "Ma'am," one young lieutenant asked, "what advice would you give to someone who wants to ensure that their organization values all personnel regardless of their background or current position?" Rebecca considered the question carefully, thinking about all the lessons she had learned through years of hidden service, public revelation, and institutional reform. "Lieutenant, I would say that real leadership means looking beyond surface appearances to understand the capabilities and potential of every person in your organization. Don't assume that someone's current role defines their limits, and don't let rank or position substitute for respect and professionalism." The lieutenant nodded thoughtfully. "Ma'am, how do you balance recognizing hidden expertise with respecting people's privacy about their backgrounds?" "That's the key challenge," Rebecca replied. "The goal is to create environments where people feel safe being honest about their capabilities without feeling pressured to disclose more than they're comfortable sharing. It requires building trust and demonstrating that diverse expertise is valued rather than seen as threatening." As the reception concluded, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her from a hidden seamstress to a recognized leader in institutional reform. Her small tattoo had indeed changed everything, not just for herself, but for thousands of people throughout the defense establishment, who now worked in environments built on mutual respect rather than hierarchical assumptions. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. It had required sustained effort, political support, and the willingness of many people to examine and change long-held beliefs about worth, authority, and expertise. But the results had proven that institutional change was possible when individual courage was combined with systematic reform efforts. Walking back to her car through the well-lit pathways of the modern training center, Rebecca thought about Jennifer, Martinez, and the countless other people who were benefiting from protocols and training programs that had emerged from her own ordeal. The work was far from finished, but the foundation had been laid for a military establishment that truly valued all its personnel, regardless of their backgrounds or current positions. Rebecca's story had become more than just an inspirational tale about standing up to discrimination. It had evolved into a blueprint for institutional transformation that proved individual integrity and courage could create lasting change when channeled through systematic reform efforts. Her legacy was not just the awards and recognition she had received, but the thousands of people who now worked in environments where their contributions were valued, their expertise was recognized, and their dignity was protected. The button sewer had indeed rigged something explosive, not a device designed to destroy, but a transformation designed to build a better, more inclusive future for everyone who served their country. Up next, you've got two more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.